Now, this past week, I celebrated my 47th birthday, and so I'm past that age where I can say I'm in my mid-40s. Now I'm in my late 40s. And for my family, we went out to dinner at Texas Roadhouse. I was very excited about that because I love a good prime rib. And I know some of you question, well, I'm not sure that's good prime rib. It was good enough for me. And we had leftovers, and I'm always excited about that because I order a big slab so that, I can't finish it, but so that I can come home and have some for the next day. But we also make sure that there's leftovers for the kids as well. And the problem was when we got home and my wife Melissa wanted to cook dinner for the kids the next day, they weren't having it. They didn't want the leftovers at all. And I'm just like, what is wrong? These are not my children. But my wife has a secret weapon. She can transform any kind of leftover meat into fried rice, and the kids love it. So, you just stir fry it, mix it with some vegetables and some rice and some eggs. And that's the most important ingredient because they love eggs, which Melissa keeps in stock for just such an emergency as this. So you can imagine her surprise and her consternation when she expected a full carton of eggs, only to find there was only one left. Because two of our family members secretly steal eggs late at night for their late-night instant ramen. So, you can imagine my wife's surprise and consternation, and I was on the receiving end of that fury. And I had to text Emily. I can't remember if I texted you or if I called you, but I told her, it's best if you just avoid Melissa for a few hours, and whatever you do, don't bring up eggs. But I can understand for my wife how tiresome it would be for her to have her reserves constantly and consistently completely depleted by other people, right? And there are times when in your relationship with God, you are serving other people, you're serving God, and you do ministry, and it's kind of like that. You start off with a full carton, but before you know it, you're starting to feel completely drained by the needs of this person and this other person, until there's nothing left and you're empty. And I'm not talking about just being a pastor, because every person who follows Jesus, we are all called to love and serve Jesus by loving and serving people around us. And I don't mean simply as being a greeter on Sunday mornings or being on the setup team or participating in a neighborhood outreach. Excuse me. Because ministry is not just in the roles, but in the relationships we have with people, where we speak the truth about Jesus into other people's lives, how the gospel speaks truth and life into your work situation, into your relationships, into somebody's conflicts or their attitudes or their choices. And it just happens that being a greeter or setting up or doing outreach, that's just the avenue. But the point is to point people towards Jesus. That's the real mission, the real ministry. The other stuff is just the role or the function that we do. And so as we all engage in this mission, in this ministry as followers of Jesus, how do we prevent from feeling overwhelmed and emptied by the needs of others as we minister the gospel to the people around us? Turn in your Bible to John chapter 6. I think Jesus wants to answer that question. We are in this series called Supernatural, as we walk through the Gospel of John. For those of us who are overly comfortable with our lives, overly familiar with the good news about Jesus, John invites us into this fourth and final gospel to encounter the supernatural God who calls us out of our comfort zones into a life of faith with Jesus. And as you know, we've been going through this entire gospel, and it records Jesus performing significant, miraculous signs to reveal his glory and his identity as the incarnate Son of God and Savior. And Jesus is going to do that again today, in today's passage. But I want you to remember something we've been teaching you, that Jesus uses these physical signs, these miraculous signs, to point to spiritual truths. And throughout John, the people who experience them often miss the point. And so I want you to pay attention to how the crowd reacts to this miracle versus how his disciples react. And think about, who is this lesson really for? And we're going to discover it's not really for the crowd, but for those who are committed to Jesus, who are following in obedience to him. And so the big idea of this passage this morning is that Jesus empowers his followers to trust him in his mission and our ministry to other people. And you're going to notice, as we read through this passage, when Jesus speaks in this passage, he only talks to the disciples. He doesn't talk to the crowds of people. He's empowering them to join him in his Father's work. And like them, we want to be able to answer How do we do that? How do we do that ministry when people's needs are so big and when what I have to give is so little? John chapter 6, verse 1. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now, the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "Well, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." And now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. Let's stop right there. So in verses 1 through 4, we are now in the second year of Jesus' ministry. It's been a year that's passed since the last Passover, when you might remember Jesus was turning heads and turning tables by clearing the temple in Jerusalem. And now he's returned home to his home region of Galilee, and he takes all his followers, his disciples, kind of on a hillside holiday to catch their breath for a minute. But there are all these people who are following in droves because they are astounded and entertained by all the miraculous signs that he's performing. So in verse 5, Jesus lifts his eyes, it says, and I want you to catch this because that is just like he told the disciples in chapter 4, verse 36, to lift their eyes to see that the fields of people are ripe for the harvest. So Jesus lifts his eyes and sees this large crowd approaching, and he asks Philip this key question: where are we to buy bread so that the people may eat? And what is he saying when he asks that? 2 things, right? Number 1, we means that the disciples are not just part of the audience, they are participants. They're invited to involvement in the work and in the mission. Secondly, he's asking Philip, how should they go about feeding all these people, both literally and spiritually? Verse 6 tells us that Jesus is testing him, because he already knows the answer. He already knows he's going to perform a miracle. Now, I want you to catch this, because a lot of us have that mentality that God is testing us, and this is not a pass-fail kind of moment. Like, oh, you didn't do it right, and therefore you're not a good Christian, you're not a good follower, you're not a good disciple. Jesus doesn't rebuke them. If you read the passage carefully, he doesn't rebuke them for their answers. It's not a matter of passing or failing. He's testing them as a teaching moment. It's not how resourceful can you be to feed and minister to all these people, but instead, when the need is so great, who or what are you going to rely on to provide? How do the disciples respond? Philip, in verse 7, he says, even if I had 8 months' paychecks, that's not enough. In verses 8 and 9, Andrew, well, how about there's a boy over here with 5 barley loaves, 2 fish. That's a decent start, right? That sounds like a pretty good quantity-sized meal. But I wanted you to get a picture of what this meal looks like. Barley is not, when you have a loaf of barley, it's more like a roll, about a fist-sized piece of bread. And if you don't know much about, grains and stuff, barley is less gluten and also less tasty alternative to wheat. And it was the common alternative of those who were poor in the ancient Near East. And so it's kind of like, like when you were growing up, some of you, maybe you're my age, like when you get grape drink instead of grape juice. That's the difference between barley and wheat. And when it says the word fish here, that they were given 2 fish, you're thinking like, oh, a fish, 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 fish. But actually the original language word there literally means little fish. Like if you speak Spanish, it's the difference between a pescado, fish, and pescadito. And that's the word that they use, the latter one. These 2 tiny fish, the kind that you would dry in the Middle East for a snack. And so what you're picturing in your mind is 5 rolls, fist-sized rolls, 2 sardines that are small enough, of course, for this little boy or this young man to carry as his sack lunch. And it kind of sounds maybe like the image. Let's pull up that image. That's kind of what I think of when I hear, this is what, realistically, when he's bringing this sack lunch to Jesus, this is kind of what Jesus is saying. So glancing at the crowd, Andrew kind of concludes, what good is so little for so many, he says. There's so many needs. I don't have enough, or what I have is not enough. That's what these 2 disciples say. What are they really saying? We can't do this. This is beyond our human capability and capacity to handle. You ever feel like that? When someone shares with you maybe their real need or their real pain in their lives, and wonder, how in the world can I help? How in the world can I minister Jesus in this person's difficulties? There's so many needs. What I have is not enough. And so what some of us do is we respond out of our convenience. Well, I'll only help if I have enough time and energy or money. Out of the excess and my leftovers, I'll help someone. Others, we respond out of our folly. We're generous, but we're unwise. And so we give what we do not have in ways that God did not call us to do, and we end up in ruin, burnt out and bitter, even towards Jesus. Or we respond out of our fear. I am too tired and too busy. There's no way I can't give any of my dollars and days to minister to anyone till my schooling is done, till my kids are older, till my job slows down, till I retire. So we respond out of our facility, our own folly, or our own fear instead of our faith. And these are all limited solutions. They're all the same because the perspective is the same. I am relying on what I can do instead of what Jesus does. Verse 10. Jesus has his disciples, gets them to seat all the people on this large grass area. How many of them? 5,000 men in a patriarchal society's perspective. But there must have been women and children too, right? Because we saw a little boy who contributed his little Happy Meal. And it says that with them, probably if you were to calculate, most theologians agree that there was at least 12,000 people there. To give you a rough idea what that looks like, that is a number that could pack out the new Chase Center for the Warriors. In verse 11, Jesus takes this little Happy Meal, thanks his Father for the supernatural manifestation of his provision and power that he's about to do. So what's the lesson here? Here's how you feed others. Give me, Jesus, what little you have, and let's see, as I look to my Father, what he can do with it. And I want you to imagine being one of the disciples at this point in time. They're offering Jesus what little food they have, what little faith they have in this moment. And you're receiving chunks of bread in your hands. You're giving it to one hungry person, to another. You're handing out by the handful. Then you come back to Jesus and you receive more, and it just keeps coming. And it's this seemingly bottomless well that Jesus keeps giving to you till every man, woman, and child has ate their fill. It says in verse 11, as much as they wanted. And it's not just about the physical multiplying, the physical miracle of multiplying common, ordinary bread. This all points to a spiritual lesson to multiply common, ordinary disciples. That Jesus takes what little faith we have and also multiplies it in ministry to feed others, way beyond our limited reason, resources, and reserves. That's often when we discover where man ends is often where God begins. And so I think of this man, there's a Christian man who shared this story. He encountered a homeless person on his walk home, and he felt this conviction from God to just stop and talk to him. But in his mind, he was kind of wrestling in that brief second. You know what? I don't have time for this. I need to get home. I need to help my wife with the kids. I have a meeting later. But that thought kept persisting. So he stopped, approached this man, and asked, "Hi, how are you? How can I pray for you?" And this man decided to open up his heart and start pouring out this story of ruin. He had lost everything in the 2008 stock market crash. He lost his home, he lost his job, and so he started turning to something to self-medicate and started using drugs. And at some point, his wife had had enough, and she left him. Is there anything you can do to help me? Maybe just a couple bucks so that I can get something to eat or take the train somewhere. And internally, this Christian man, he's sighing because the need is so much, and what I have is so little. What can I possibly do? I can't fix this man's life. I can't fix this situation. And so he fishes out his wallet, discovers, of course, I don't have any cash on me. He's looking through his stuff. This is my ID card, a credit card. I'm not going to give him my credit cards. And the only thing that he could give him that he didn't need to keep was he had a Subway card and a card with a Bible verse on it, Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. And so he kind of sheepishly offered, you want these two cards? And the man took them, and then he prayed for him, but he had very little faith that anything would change. 6 months later, he is walking that same path home when another man stops him. Handsome, clean-shaven young man. Excuse me, but are you John? Yes, I am. I don't know if you remember me, because the last time we met, I was homeless. You gave me 2 cards, subway ticket and one with a Bible verse on me. I was going through immense withdrawal sickness at the time, thinking to myself, I either need a fix or I need help. And when you gave me that subway ticket, it was like God was telling me, instead of going to a drug dealer to take the train downtown to this homeless shelter where I could get into rehab. And so I took the train, but by the time I got to the shelter, I just stood outside for the longest time. It seemed like a long time, shaking and petrified, when I finally flipped over and read the other card. Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And it gave me the courage to take that next step and walk through those doors. I've been clean and sober ever since. I even have a part-time job now. So I just wanted to thank you. I've been coming out here every week, same time, same place, hoping that you would come by again. You ever look at what little you have and wonder, what difference would this possibly make? But when we bring what little we have to Jesus, He can take our little time, our little subway ticket, our little Bible knowledge, our little faith, and vastly multiply it to do what only God can do. And I wonder how many times maybe you've taken what little you've had, offered your little bread, your little fish, the little money you had, the little time you had, the little care you had, the little faith that you had, and unknowingly, God multiplied it many, many times more than you possibly could imagine. So I want to ask you this morning, who has Jesus put in your sight, on your heart, where the need is so great, but what I have is so little? Where the reality of their circumstance seems to loom larger than the reality of God. And I want to challenge you. Would you consider taking what little you have, your little resources, your little reserves, your little faith, give it to Jesus, and then pray like Jesus in dependence and obedience to the Father, and see how He might multiply it in someone's situation, far greater than you could possibly imagine. I wonder how much He might show up and show off. What if it's not our job to fix people's situations by human means, but to point to the one who can? Because He is by far a much better Messiah than you or I. Okay, this is helpful knowing how we can tangibly and spiritually minister the gospel to other peoples when we don't feel like we can do much or that we have much. We can point them to Jesus. But what about when we're exhausted and burnt out from serving the Lord? Verse 12. And when they had eaten their fill, He told His disciples, gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." And perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. What's happening here? Verses 12 and 13. Let me ask you a question. Why does Jesus instruct his followers to gather the leftovers so that none of it is lost? Why? Do you realize there are only 12 baskets? There's a lot of leftovers, okay? There's a ton. After feeding like 10,000 people, there's 12 baskets full of leftover bread. That is pretty miraculous. But I also want to point out to you that there's only 12 baskets left. So it's not the kind of baskets that you're going to divide amongst 5,000 takeout boxes for the crowd to take home with them. It's not for the crowd. So who's it for? Later in this passage, in John chapter 6, verses 67 and 70, we'll learn for the first time, at least in the Gospel of John, that Jesus chose 12 disciples. It's for them, 12 baskets for 12 disciples. It's their provision. And so there's a lesson here, and it's not for the crowd. In fact, Jesus is going to give the crowd a timeout. In verses 14 and 15, the crowd, they saw this miraculous sign. They lose their minds and start declaring, "My dudes, Jesus is the promised prophet, this promised deliverer who's greater than Moses, predicted in Deuteronomy chapter 18. And so we're going to force him to be our king and to fulfill our agenda," and they completely miss the point of this miraculous happening. And so Jesus retreats from them and goes further up the mountain. It says, "Later, skaters." And in verses 16 and 17, night falls. Jesus is nowhere to be found. The disciples are exhausted from a whole day of ministry. So they crawl into their boat with their 12 baskets, and they set off across the sea back home. Now, this might seem like a detour in the story, because actually the rest of chapter 6, which we'll cover next week, we'll see that Jesus is going to continue teaching the crowd about the bread, starting from verse 22. So this whole story about miraculous feeding the 5,000 with bread, and then he's going to talk about, "I, Jesus, am the bread of life." So it seems like this is a kind of an interruption or a sidebar, like, "John, did you need to record this detail?" But this moment is just for the disciples. I think that there's something there that he wants to underscore the same point for them and for us as he does in the 12 baskets. So verse 18 and 19, they're about 3 miles out to sea. The wind starts to pick up. The boat is starting to rock violently. Have you ever been on a ship in the midst of a storm? You know, when it starts to rain, and it starts to rain harder and harder and harder, and you may wonder, is this dangerous? But if you were to ask somebody who's an experienced sailor or fisherman, what they would tell you is, it's not the rain that can kill you, it's the wind. Because if there's no wind, then there's no waves, and the rain will just run off the side of the boat. But if the wind is strong, the waves grow bigger and bigger and can obliterate a small boat in a matter of minutes. So I want you to imagine being one of the disciples. It's gotten dark. It's getting stormy. You're clutching your basket, and you're facing the reality that I may die by drowning at this moment, and there's no way that Jesus can be here. There's no way that he can be what we need. He is 3 miles away on shore. So I want you to remember that this story, what happens next, is not for the benefit of the crowd. They are miles away, safely asleep or safely on shore. And what the Bible doesn't say here in this passage is, "Oh, look, Jesus calmed the storm. He has authority over the winds and the waves. What an all-powerful, all-providing king he'd make." That's true. He can, and he is. But But instead, the focus in verses 19 through 21 is that Jesus himself comes to them. In the supernatural power of God, he is walking on top of the water, and he declares to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." And look at their attitude. They gladly welcome him into the boat. Their terror turns into joy because their master is here. His presence comforts them, strengthens them, satisfies them. His presence is enough. And with that, this story within a story is immediately over. They arrive safely at their desired haven. And not a word of this incident is said to the crowd. The crowd never hears about it. So I propose to you that the point that is being made twice in both the bread and on the sea is the same thing. That as we pour ourselves out for Jesus and his mission, that he pours himself into us. That as he involves us in providing for others, that Jesus also provides for us, ultimately with his presence. That for followers of Jesus, this is not a story about getting people out of storms, but a story about getting Jesus into your boat. I, Jesus, did this miracle for you guys on land. I gave you each a basket full of bread to show you that I will be your provision. That if you're overwhelmed, this overwhelming ministry is in front of you, like feeding 5,000 people, you feel totally inadequate. Not only will I give to you to feed others, but I'll be there for you when it's all over. I'm not just going to give you bread, I will be your bread. And now, I've done another miracle for you. In case you didn't get it the first time, I've shown you in the darkness and in the storm that you are not abandoned, you are not forgotten, that I will let nothing separate you from me. I'll walk on water to be with you. I'll climb on a cross to get to you till I bleed to death that you might have life. And when you take me into your boat, there will be joy, and you will arrive safely at the haven that I've appointed for you. I want to tell you about my mom. My mom has been a believer, like sometimes she was the only believer in my family for a long time, and she has faithfully served the Lord since she was very young. I have distinct memories of her, even when we were living in Florida, of a loving and welcoming people and boldly sharing the gospel. And as many of you know, my dad died of liver cancer when I was a kid. And at the funeral, someone snapped a photo of her. And I was trying desperately to dig it up last night. I couldn't find it. But I have this vivid memory of this photo of my mom holding my 8-year-old hand, carrying my 3-year-old brother. You can't imagine 3-year-olds. That's my daughter Violet's age. And she looks beautiful. And there's a hint of a smile on her face. And I always wondered, you lost your husband, you lost your income, you lost your future. You've served Jesus faithfully, and this is what you get? Aren't you angry? Aren't you angry at God? What do you have to smile about? And I actually asked her that question. And she said, I don't fully remember what was going on in that picture, but I remember that day I was actually incredibly sad. I think there are moments that I could smile because I learned that day that Jesus is real, that he comforts those who hurt. That never before or since have I experienced his presence in a more powerful way than on that day when I buried my husband. And that Jesus is better than all the husbands that he can give to every woman. And that as I follow and serve God, I can choose to dwell in bitterness or Jesus, but I cannot choose both. As you pour yourself out in ministry to people, at your work, at your school, at church, in your community, Jesus will be that basket for you. 12 disciples, 12 baskets full. You give and he supplies. That as we serve him, even when darkness and storms overtake us, when your boat and your life are rocked, when you cannot see Jesus, we simply wait upon him And then He comes to you. He gets in the boat with you. He will be your peace and your strength and your joy and your life when you feel like you have nothing left. He'll see to it that you get to where you need to be. He will bring you to that haven with Him, whether in this life or in the one to come. So Jesus tests Philip. Where are we to buy bread? And Jesus tests us as we face great needs in the lives of our peers and our coworkers and people who open up to you or people far from Jesus. Where are you going to get bread? How are you going to feed them for me? Jesus asked. And we need to remember, when Jesus tests us, this is not a test so that He will know how strong we are, but so that we will know how strong He is. Jesus empowers us to trust Him in His mission, our ministry to other people. And because of these promises to give us what we need, especially Himself and His presence, then we can be very generous. We can risk many storms. And so I want to challenge you to be generous risk takers as a church when the need is so great and when what I have is so little. When you serve Jesus, there are moments that you give and give till you can't give anymore. I will take care of you, Jesus says. I will always be enough for you. The more you satisfy others, the more Jesus will be your satisfaction. The more you give life to others, the more Jesus will be life to you. So that even when the darkness and the storm comes, He comes to you. He brings His joy. So let me ask you, who is God calling you to minister the gospel to? There are people, there's a person that Jesus is wanting you to recall. Will you remember what He can do? You never have to worry about, I can't do enough. What I have is not enough. The need is too big. But Jesus can do what only He will do. God our Father, we ask humbly in this moment that You would bring to mind who or what Jesus has put in our sight, has put on our hearts, where the need is so great, where what I have is so little. Would You bring that person or situation to mind even now? Give us courage to offer You what little we have. Would You give us confidence that You can multiply it for Your glory and their good? Would You give us comfort when the darkness and the storm comes, that You will give us more of You, that we're not simply cogs in a ministry or church machine, but that You love us. We are Your children. May we rest in the strength and the peace of having Jesus and dwelling more and more with Him.